In this video, we're going to examine the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. As we do this, I'm going to show you things from a different perspective than you've probably ever seen before. Of course, what you choose to believe is up to you, but consider this. For any explanation to be correct, it needs to answer a lot of questions. And those answers need to be consistent with each other and with the known facts of the case. As you will soon see, none of this is rocket science, but it does require that we focus and do a little thinking, so I'm not going to ask you to sit back and enjoy this video. Instead, I hope you will lean forward, take a few notes, rewind and re-examine the video when you need to, and join me in solving at least some of the most perplexing issues related to this crime. Elsie Dorman may have been the worst camera operator in Dealey Plaza that day. She didn't seem to quite grasp the concept of holding the camera steady. But in her film, we get a glimpse of a little 13-year-old girl who was doing a much better job of operating her movie camera. Her name was Tina Towner, and that brings us to the first question we'll be trying to resolve. Over the years, Tina's movie has been all but ignored by JFK researchers. In it, she captures the limousine as it turns from Houston onto Elm Street. More importantly, she may have captured President Kennedy reacting to the first shot that was fired that day, several seconds before Abraham Zapruder had even begun to film. Her film captured the limousine as it passed in front of the Daltex building, which was across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. As the limousine makes that turn, President Kennedy begins to wave to the crowd. But then something rather strange happened. He starts to wave to the crowd, but then within half a second, he pulls his hand back and balls it into a fist. Please watch closely and keep in mind that this is in extreme slow motion. Each frame lasts for about 1/18 of a second. And then something else happened that was pretty strange. The film was damaged, and approximately 7 frames were destroyed. It was during those 7 missing frames that President Kennedy fell sharply to his left. Because the frames were deleted, we aren't able to see it happen, but we can easily see him straighten back up. And this is not an optical illusion. Compare President Kennedy's motion with Jackie and the other people in the car. He's the only one who reacts this way. Okay, so JFK starts to raise his right hand to wave to the crowd, but then suddenly he pulls it back and balls his hand into a fist, and then he falls sharply to his left, and then he straightens back up. There had to be a reason for that. There had to be a cause. According to Gary Mack at the 6th Floor Museum, Tina Towner said that no one in her family knows when or how those frames were destroyed. So if Tina's family didn't damage the film, then it must have happened while it was in the FBI's possession. Over the years, I've examined every available film to try to find one that would give us a better look at JFK's reaction then. I almost found it in the film taken by Robert Hughes, which also captured the limousine as it made that turn onto Elm Street. It was taken from a greater distance, but the original frames could be blown up and would very likely show JFK's movement then. But guess what happened? The film was damaged at exactly the same point in time that Tina's film was damaged. So it appears that the FBI destroyed frames in both the Towner and the Hughes films, which depicted the same fraction of a second in which President Kennedy reacted to that first shot. Now, if that wasn't done deliberately, then at the very least, it proves that they were certainly interested in those frames, enough so that they stopped the film to examine them long enough to let them burn up. Many theorists, including most of the government defenders, believe that an early shot struck the pavement, which explains why some witnesses recall seeing sparks flying up from the road. That would suggest that President Kennedy could have been pelted by small pieces of asphalt or metal. But in spite of his reaction, the president doesn't appear to be too concerned. He seems to have felt something, but like the others around him, he didn't hear anything that he perceived to be a gunshot. In fact, Tina Towner stated that she never heard a gunshot until sometime after she stopped filming. So, one of two things happened. The president's reactions were either caused by something other than a gunshot, or they were the result of a gunshot that no one heard. This is an overhead view of the intersection of Houston and Elm Street. Notice the positions of Tina Towner, the Texas School Book Depository, and the Daltex building. I have also illustrated the positions of the limousine as it made that very sharp turn onto Elm. What I believe I can demonstrate is that the earliest shots that day were fired from the third floor of the Daltex building. We get a good look at that building and the windows facing down Elm Street in this photo taken by James Alchins. I used to believe that the shots came from behind the fire escape, but I think I was mistaken about that. The angle for the shots as the limo turned onto Elm Street would actually be better from the southernmost window facing west down Elm. If we blow up this very high-resolution copy of the Alton's photo and bring up the contrast a bit, we make an extremely interesting discovery about that window. Look closely. Part of that window has been broken out. As we see in other windows, the glass looks a bit grayish, probably because the windows are dusty. But in places where there is no glass, the area looks darker. And the location of that broken area is fully consistent with where a shooter sitting a few feet back from the window would want it to be. In 1963, there were only a few offices on that third floor, and much of it was used to store boxes, so it would have been easy to set up a sniper's nest similar to the one in the depository. Only one professional criminal was apprehended in Dealey Plaza that day. His name was Jim Braden, and he was discovered on the third floor of the Daltex building. When he was first questioned, Braden admitted that he was in the Daltex building during the assassination. But after he was taken to the sheriff's office, he changed his story, claiming that he was only there after the shooting had ended. He later told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he was visiting his parole officer during the assassination, a claim that his parole officer, Roger Carroll, refused to confirm. We'll be talking more about Braden later. This is a photo taken from the Daltex building looking west down Elm Street. The view and the angles from there are absolutely perfect. But being in such an excellent location, how could the shooter have missed and hit the pavement? Well, I'm going to answer that question for you, but first let me ask you a question. If you were that sniper and you just missed the entire limousine, what would you do next? That's right, you'd fire again, wouldn't you? Shortly after Tina stopped shooting, Abraham Zapruder turned on his camera. To see when the next shot was fired, we'll be looking at extreme blow-ups of the earliest parts of that film. Notice the president dropping his right hand. Shortly after frame 165, we will see a sequence of movements by the President and Mrs. Kennedy, which I believe are quite significant. At this point, Mrs. Kennedy, who would later testify that she was looking to her left when she heard the first noise, begins to turn toward her husband. Like many other witnesses, Mrs. Kennedy was adamant that the first noise didn't sound at all like a gunshot. Also, please pay close attention to President Kennedy's hands, which he has brought to rest together. His fingers at this point are interlaced. At the same time that Mrs. Kennedy begins to react, the President starts to separate his hands, which had been together for only 15 frames, or 5/6 of 1 second. Mrs. Kennedy continues to turn toward her husband. But look at the President's hands now. In particular, look at the fingers of his left hand, which had been interlaced with his right hand. The President raised his right hand before he even separated it from his left, causing him to pull his left hand upward by several inches, and the fingers of his left hand to be splayed and pointing straight up. Before high-resolution versions of the Zapruder film were available to the public, most researchers believed that JFK was smiling in frame 180. But when we zoom in and get a better look at him, I don't think there's much doubt that we're seeing a grimace rather than a smile. In the next clear frame, we see that as he raised his hand, JFK was simultaneously twisting to his right. By frame 193, he has turned more than 90 degrees to his right and is clearly shielding his face with his right hand. Notice also that Mrs. Kennedy has turned completely to her right, exactly as she said she did in response to that first noise. So by this point in time, we seem to have seen two distinct reactions by President Kennedy. Now, if those were caused by gunshots, then the shooter did exactly what we would expect him to do. He fired again, and with exactly the same result, he missed. When I first heard the theory that one shot missed the entire limousine and struck the pavement, I didn't believe it. I mean, how could anybody shoot that badly? But if we look into what is really the only plausible explanation for how this could have happened, it all starts to make sense. Weapons expert Mark White wrote an article for Small Arms Review magazine, which also appeared at the Guns.Connect website. In it, Mr. White discussed problems associated with the use of noise suppressors on rifles. As Mr. White points out, suppressors, also known as silencers, are notorious for causing misfires, because even the tiniest misalignment can cause gunshots to go wildly off course. His article came out 35 years after the assassination, but even then, many silencers were having serious problems. In addition to the problems of misalignment, some suppressors were still using baffles that also caused shots to go astray. Keep in mind that White was talking about professionally manufactured suppressors that were decades more advanced than what was available in 1963, and silencers used by the Mafia were frequently homemade devices which were even less reliable. White, who was writing mainly for the law enforcement community, also pointed out that no enforcement officer in his right mind would ever assemble a rifle on the spot on a call out at a crime scene and expect the weapon to hold at zero. He said it might, but such an occurrence would be an abnormality. Of course, no assassin would risk being spotted carrying a fully assembled rifle and suppressor into Dealey Plaza. He would have had to plan on assembling it after he got there, making his weapon all the more unstable. Folks, if this was any other crime in history, and the shooter missed his target that badly, wouldn't the first suspicion be that the sniper was having a problem with his rifle? But there's an even better reason to believe that a faulty suppressor was used to fire the early shots. Shortly after that last reaction, the president was clearly hit by a bullet. Now, if I'm correct, this was the third shot. The most common belief among researchers in the past is that this was the second. And yet the large majority of witnesses that day said they only heard one early shot and then closely bunched shots at the very end. So, of all the early shots, only one was actually noticed by most witnesses. And most witnesses who described that first audible shot said that it sounded much different than the ones they heard later. Special Agent Roy Kellerman testified that the first sound he heard was similar to a firecracker exploding in the area to the rear of the car. Like the other witnesses, he heard nothing at all following that first noise until the end of the attack, when he heard a flurry of shells come into the car. When our inspector asked him if those final gunshots sounded different from that first sound he heard, he replied, yes, definitely, very much so. Mrs. Connolly first heard a noise which she did not recognize as a gunshot. Then she looked back and saw the president obviously reacting to being hit. She went on to testify that she heard 2 more shots after that, one of which she mistakenly believed wounded her husband. We'll be talking more about that shortly. Like Mrs. Connolly, Mrs. Kennedy first heard a noise which she did not believe was a gunshot. We'll be talking more about her also. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood also confirmed that the first shot he heard was different and more like a firecracker than the last shots. Secret Service agent George Hickey, riding in the car behind the president, said that the final 2 shots he heard were completely different than the first one. Hickey also stated that the first shot sounded like it came from ground level, which suggests that what really made that shot audible was the fact that it shattered when it struck the pavement. Reporter James Underwood described the first noise this way: I thought it was an explosion. I've heard many rifles fired, but it did not sound like a rifle to me. I believe I said to one of the other fellows, it sounds like a giant firecracker. Witness James Tague described that first noise this way: about this time I heard what sounded like a firecracker. Well, a very loud firecracker. It certainly didn't sound like a rifle shot. Texas Governor John Connally, on the other hand, testified that he thought the first shot really did sound like a gunshot. Warren Commissioner Allen Dulles responded, "You and one other happen to be the only witnesses who have indicated that they recognize it as being a rifle shot. Most of the witnesses have indicated they thought it was a backfire. The first shot was a backfire or a firecracker." Okay, let's see if we can make sense out of all this. The limo proceeds to the intersection of Houston and Elm. Just as it appears in front of the Daltex building, the sniper aims at the president's head and fires. But the suppressor on his weapon causes the bullet to go astray and strike the pavement to the right of the limousine. Although not totally silent, the sound was weak enough that it was drowned out by the crowd noise and went unnoticed. A few seconds later he fires again, but the same thing happens, only this time the shot made an audible sound when it hit the pavement, and perhaps because the crowd noise had diminished, it was heard by many of the witnesses. The sniper makes one last try. By now he realizes that his shots are being pulled to the right, so he adjusts, sighting his weapon to the left of the president's head. But he has no way of knowing how to adjust his shot vertically. So instead of hitting the head, his bullet strikes the president in the upper back. But since that shot did not strike the pavement, it was heard by almost no one. Now, there's no way to be 100% certain about it. But the reactions at this point by President Kennedy and Governor Connally seem to be simultaneous. I have to believe that there's a high probability that one bullet passed through both of them. It appears that shot was fired at frame 223, blowing Governor Connally's jacket open on the right side. The expulsion of blood and tissue caused the governor's tie to be blown to his left. It's easier to see what happened by watching the sequence of frames, including those just before and just after 223. The jacket has clearly been blown open, exposing a larger portion of his white dress shirt. Because his right arm was resting on the jacket, it held the coat taut, so that the jacket snapped immediately back into place after the bullet had passed. This is the sequence again. In the past, some researchers thought the passing bullet hit the lapel, causing it to flip over, but the bullet actually exited several inches to the right of the lapel, so that couldn't have been the cause. President Kennedy's arms first began to rise at frame 226, 3 frames or 1/6 of a second later. Some critics have argued that his reaction was too fast, suggesting that he must have been hit earlier. But it's important to understand the nature of those reactions. People have always believed that he was raising his hands to his throat, but that's not what he was doing. Try an experiment here. Raise your own hands to your throat. Now look at your elbows. Why did they remain at your side rather than rise like President Kennedy's did? The location where the president was hit in the back was very close to cervical vertebrae number 7, which just happens to be the place where nerves are located that connect directly to the elbow extensors, which are the muscles that cause the elbows to go up and down. And as any neurologist will tell you, such reactions are extremely fast because unlike reactions to loud noises, the nerves are stimulated directly without having to first be processed by the brain. But there is something else about this shot that's even more important than the single bullet theory, and that's the fact that no one heard it. We already know that the large majority of witnesses reported hearing only one early shot, and that seems to have been the one that was fired just before frame 170. One important confirmation is that Mrs. Kennedy said she was looking to her left when she heard that noise, as we see her at frame 170, just before she turns back toward her husband. But by frame 223, when the next shot was fired, she was turned fully to her right. So if Mrs. Kennedy was correct, she must have heard that noise when the earlier of those two shots was fired. Another extremely important clue comes from Governor Connally, who testified that he never heard the shot that hit him. Connally remained fully conscious at the time and heard people around him talking, but like most others in Dealey Plaza that day, he never heard the shot that wounded him and probably President Kennedy. One of the greatest myths associated with this case was the claim that shots from Oswald's rifle were drowned out by the crowd noise or the motorcycles. But when the House Select Committee on Assassinations tested an identical rifle in Dealey Plaza, they found out how loud it really was. The House Select Committee on Assassinations tested that rifle in Dealey Plaza by positioning microphones at various distances from the alleged sniper's nest and then measuring the sound levels when shots were fired. The first sound that witnesses heard was actually the bullet's shock wave, which by the way comes directly from the bullet itself rather than the rifle. It generated a brief but extremely loud noise, which was measured at 130 decibels within 10 feet of the bullet's path. The muzzle blast followed almost immediately behind the shock wave. Any shots that were fired from the alleged murder weapon would have exposed the people in the limousine to sound levels between 115 and 135 decibels. So how loud is 115 to 135 decibels? Well, a noisy vacuum cleaner will typically generate sound levels between 70 and 80 decibels. "90 decibels is the level that's commonly used by psychologists to startle test subjects. That also happens to be the level at which prolonged exposure can cause permanent hearing loss. Now, sound levels double every 10 decibels, so 100 decibels is twice as loud as 90, 110 is twice as loud as 100, and so on. Therefore, the people who rode with President Kennedy were exposed to extremely high levels that were up to 16 times as loud as the levels used by psychologists, and 50% louder than you would hear standing 4 feet from a pneumatic riveter. In fact, the people who conducted the test were really surprised at how loud the gunshots really were. They couldn't understand how anybody could have misconstrued them to be firecrackers or backfires. They also brought in motorcycles to see if they would drown out the sound of the shots. But the motorcycles didn't make any difference, and they concluded that the shots were so loud that any reasonable level of background noise would have been low in comparison with the shots themselves. So by studying the visible reactions of the limo passengers, we can easily see when they were exposed to high-powered rifle shots, which could have been fired by Oswald, and when they were not. The witnesses basically told us they heard no particularly loud shots until the very end of the attack, and studying them in the film, it's clear that they were correct. The next question we'll address is, where did the single bullet theory shot come from? Was it the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository? Or was it more likely that it came from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building? Interestingly, some of the people who tried hardest to prove that the shot was fired by Oswald wound up proving exactly the opposite. This is from a documentary presented on the Discovery Channel. Their team set up a tower at exactly the height of that 6th floor window, and they placed their models in exactly the same relative positions to President Kennedy and Governor Connally. Watch what happened.
Amazingly, Alex has replicated the magic bullet shot.
But contrary to what the narrator told us, the path of their bullet was way off. It should have hit Governor Connally at about the level of his armpit. The red line, by the way, was theirs. Now compare that with the trajectory from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building. The alignment is perfect. Over the years, no one has worked harder to promote the lone nut theory than Dale Myers. But look at this image from his own 3D animation, which also appeared on the Discovery Channel. This was from his 3D animation, which included a trajectory line going back to the 6th floor of the depository. But if we extend Myers' own line, we see that like the other Discovery Channel presentation, it strikes Governor Connally much too low. Once again, we can compare it with a shot from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building. And once again, the alignment is perfect. The House Select Committee on Assassinations recognized this problem and tried to compensate for it by claiming that JFK was leaning forward much further than he actually was. This is their illustration. But what about the horizontal angle? This image was carefully calculated by experts for the House Select Committee on Assassinations and based on very precise measurements taken by surveyors. Notice that they had to move Connally far to the left side of his seat in order to make it work. They had to do that because the angle from the depository was between 9 and 10 degrees. Now, more recent theories, which place the single bullet theory a bit later, still require an angle of around 7 to 8 degrees. But there was absolutely no good reason to misposition Governor Connally that way. If we put him back to a plausible position in the center of his car seat, we find that the correct horizontal angle for that shot would have to have been around 2 degrees. Please look closely at this diagram of Dealey Plaza. That 2-degree angle points directly back to the same window in the Daltex building. But is there really any reason to suspect that there might be someone up there who would want to kill President Kennedy? Jim Braden, who we mentioned earlier, was not only on the 3rd floor of the Daltex building that day, but the night before he was at the Mafia-owned Cabana Hotel, where another fellow just happened to be, and his name was Jack Ruby. Braden was a known member of organized crime who had connections to David Ferry and Carlos Marcello, the Mafia godfather who confessed to an FBI informant that he had ordered the assassination and that Ferry had introduced him to Lee Harvey Oswald. Researchers later discovered that Braden had worked at the Pere Marquette building in New Orleans, on the same floor where David Ferry came in regularly to pick up his mail. The building was owned by Carlos Marcello. Now at this point, some of you must be thinking, the bullet that fell out from Governor Connally's leg must have been fired by Oswald, because it was positively linked to Oswald's rifle. But critics have always been skeptical of this bullet because of its near-pristine condition, and when the grooves of the bullet were examined microscopically, there was no trace of human blood or tissue. As we will see, there are even better reasons to be skeptical. The FBI told the Warren Commission that CE-399 was found on Governor Connolly's stretcher by hospital orderly Darrell Tomlinson. Tomlinson did indeed find a bullet on the stretcher that day, but he has always been adamant that the stretcher he found it on was not Connolly's.
Darrell Tomlinson, a Parkland Hospital employee, reenacts how he found that bullet on a stretcher. The bullet was ballistically traced to Oswald's rifle. The Warren Commission concluded that it was the bullet that had wounded both men and that it had fallen out of Connolly's clothing onto his hospital stretcher.
The bullet was found here in this area, and not on that stretcher. That's the stretcher I took off the elevator.
The stretcher he took off the elevator was Connolly's, so Tomlinson found the bullet on a different stretcher not connected to the case. This led critics to claim the bullet was planted, but the commission decided Tomlinson was mistaken.
It was there when I came up.
Of course, that doesn't mean that a bullet was planted. What is far more likely is that the bullet Tomlinson found was from a different victim who had nothing to do with the shooting in Dealey Plaza. Look at this drawing he made for the Warren Commission. He said the stretcher labeled A was the one he took off the elevator, which was Connolly's. He said that a doctor pushed the stretcher out of the way to get into the restroom, and that he, Tomlinson, later pushed it back, which is when the bullet fell to the floor. Look at where the restroom is located. He had to have been talking about the other stretcher, not Connolly's. After discovering the bullet, Tomlinson brought it to his supervisor, Mr. O.P. Wright. Wright passed the bullet on to Secret Service agent Richard Johnson. Johnson then passed it on to his supervisor, Chief James Rowley, who then gave it to the FBI. The FBI sent the bullet off to their labs and then presented CE-399 to the Warren Commission. But after Tomlinson had testified that the bullet came from a different stretcher, the Commission started to get maybe a little bit suspicious, and they told the FBI to go back and get confirmation from the witnesses who had examined the original bullet, and that's when the trouble began. First they showed it to Secret Service agent Richard E. Johnson, but Johnson said he could not identify it as the same bullet. And then they showed it to Johnson's supervisor, James Rowley, who also refused to confirm the bullet. The FBI had the same problem with the two civilians. An FBI airtel dated 6/20 of 1964 stated that neither Tomlinson nor his supervisor O.P. Wright would confirm the bullet. That airtel, by the way, was top secret. It was never shown to the Warren Commission. Instead, they told the Warren Commission a different story. They said that FBI agent Bardwell D. Odom interviewed the two men, and that although they refused to officially confirm CE-399, they said it appeared to be the same bullet. But years later, researchers Uzziah Thompson and Dr. Gary Aguilar became suspicious when they discovered that there was no record of such an interview in the National Archives. So they contacted then-retired agent Bardwell Odom and asked him about it. He replied, "I didn't show it to anybody at Parkland. I didn't have any bullet. I don't think I ever saw it even." So, what seems to have happened is that when the FBI discovered that the bullet that Tomlinson found did not come from Oswald's rifle, they switched it for one that did. So, if the bullet found by Tomlinson was not the one that fell out of Governor Connolly's thigh, then what happened to the one that really did? Well, fortunately, Governor Connolly answered that question for us. This is from his autobiography entitled In History's Shadow. The most curious discovery of all took place when they rolled me off the stretcher and onto the examining table. A metal object fell to the floor with a click no louder than a wedding band. The nurse picked it up and slipped it into her pocket. It was the bullet from my body, the one that passed through my back, chest, and wrist, and worked itself loose from my thigh. If Governor Connolly was correct that the bullet was retrieved by a nurse, then the bullet that fell from his thigh could not have been the same one that Tomlinson found. Connolly's recollection was corroborated by the Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade, This is from an interview he gave to the Dallas Morning News on November 21st of 1993. I also went out to see Connolly, but he was in the operating room. Some nurse had a bullet in her hand and said this was on the gurney that Connolly was on. Question, what did you do with the bullet? Is this the famous pristine bullet people have talked about? I told her to give it to the police, which she said she would. I assume that's the pristine bullet. So, what did the nurse do with that bullet? Well, according to an FBI report, it was passed on to Texas Highway Patrolman Bobby M. Nolan, although the FBI described it as a fragment removed from Connolly's left thigh. Amazingly, it only took a few minutes to track down Bobby Nolan, who was alive and well and remembered the incident at Parkland Hospital like it was yesterday. With his permission, I recorded our conversation, although I had my recording level set a bit too high, which caused some clipping distortion. However, I think the conversation can still be easily understood.
Y'all was talking to a man who was one of Governor Conley's aides. His name was, I think it was Bill, it was either Stinton or Simmons. And he was an aide to the governor, and she came up and told him that she had the bullet that came off of the gurney. Now, I don't know what gurney, I think maybe Governor Conley's gurney. And she said, what do you want me to do with it? I was just sitting there in the hallway in the hospital talking, and he turned to me and said, give it to him.
A bullet fragment or a complete bullet? Or how large was it?
I don't know. It was, they told me that it was a bullet. And I don't know if it was a fragment of a bullet or if it was a whole bullet, because it was in a little small brown envelope.
Okay.
And this was sealed, and it was about, I'd say, 2 by 3 inches. And it was in that envelope when I got it. And I never did look at it or anything.
Okay. Now, when the nurse gave it to you, did she describe it as a bullet fragment or as a bullet?
No, she just said it was a bullet, that's all.
Bill Stinson also told members of the press that a bullet was retrieved from Governor Connolly's leg. But after the envelope which contained that bullet was passed on to the FBI, a miracle took place. The bullet from the governor's thigh turned into tiny fragments from his wrist. This is the evidence envelope that Officer Nolan initialed, and he confirmed that the initials were his. But look at what are supposed to be the initials of Nurse Audrey M. Bell, who actually did pass the wrist fragments on to the authorities. Someone has obviously overwritten someone else's initials and did a pretty crude job of it. When Nurse Bell was interviewed by the ARRB, they asked if she recognized her initials on this envelope. This is from her recorded interview.
At the bottom half of the envelope, there are many initials. Do you see your initials anywhere?
No?
I have another version of this.
I see my name over here, and that's...
yes.
But...
on the line that says nurses.
I don't see my initial on that.
Keep in mind that not only did Nurse Bell state that she initialed the envelope, but she had to have initialed it, or none of the authorities from any of the agencies would have accepted it. And obviously this crude forgery was not written by her. In fact, if we bring up the contrast a bit, it's easy to see that other characters have been erased. And finally, if we look at the handwriting in the upper part of the envelope, we see that everything is quite consistent and obviously by the same person. But look at the difference between this handwriting and this. They were clearly written by two different people, which suggests that the right arm location was added later. Furthermore, Nurse Audrey Bell has always been adamant that she turned the wrist fragments over to plainclothes officers, but no one was in his Texas Rangers uniform that day, and Stinson was wearing scrubs because he'd been in the operating room with Governor Connally. This is from her interview with the ARRB.
What is it that makes you think that it was the Secret Service or the FBI? Is there anything special?
Yeah, I think they identified themselves, but I just don't. I know it wasn't to the Dallas Police or the County Sheriffs or the Texas Rangers.
Okay. Well,
so it had to be. I feel it had to be a federal because they were in street clothes. They were not in uniform.
The simple facts are that every one of the four men who examined the Tomlinson bullet before it went to the FBI refused to confirm that CE-399 was the same one. And if that isn't enough, we have the governor of Texas, the Dallas district attorney, one nurse, one Texas highway patrolman, and Governor Connally's top aide, all confirming that the real bullet was recovered in his room and could not have been the one that Tomlinson found. And that makes sense because Tomlinson himself stated that he found the bullet on someone else's stretcher. I just don't know how the evidence could be any clearer. Now, I'm sure that some of you are also thinking that Dr. Vincent Gwynn, who testified before the HSCA, stated that fragments from Governor Connally's wrist matched the ammunition used in Oswald's rifle. But consider this part of Dr. Gwynn's testimony. The pieces that were brought out from the archives, which reportedly, according to Mr. Gear, were the only bullet-lead fragments from this case still present in the archives, did not include any of the specific little pieces that the FBI had analyzed. Presumably those are in existence somewhere. I'm sure nobody threw them out, but where they are, I have no idea. The simple fact is that if those fragments were from a different kind of bullet than Oswald's, the FBI could not allow Gwynn or anyone else to examine the originals. And it appears that that's exactly what happened. But let's get back to Dealey Plaza. Unlike the previous shots, the next one was extremely loud, and it was heard by everyone. It was first discovered by Dr. Louis Alvarez, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who was also a consultant for Bell and Howell, the company that built Abraham Zapruder's camera. Alvarez had worked with a documentary filmmaker in Africa who was having problems when the big game hunters they were filming fired their rifles, causing parts of the film to be blurred. He learned that this never happened when the camera was on a tripod, only when it was in the hands of a cameraman. What he discovered was the loud noise of the gunshots provoked involuntary startle reactions, which caused the operator to blur frames in a distinct and identifiable pattern. Alvarez later patented a device for Bell and Howell to eliminate this problem. Alvarez applied what he had learned to a study of the Zapruder film and submitted a paper on the subject in 1976 to the American Journal of Physics. In it he reported that there was a loud noise at precisely frame 285, which caused Zapruder to blur a series of frames which began 1/3 of a second later at frame 291. He concluded that that same noise startled Bill Greer, the driver of the limousine, and caused him to inadvertently slow the limo. But in his paper, Alvarez set what he called a boundary condition. The gunshots had to have been at least 2.3 seconds apart, since that was the shortest time in which the FBI could reload Oswald's rifle and acquire their target. But a gunshot at frame 285 would only have left a sniper 1.5 seconds to get off the fatal headshot that followed. So as a staunch Warren Commission defender, Alvarez speculated that perhaps a siren had gone off then, in spite of the fact that no witnesses recalled hearing the siren until after the shooting had ended. Perhaps it was because he was only looking at still frames from the film that Alvarez didn't realize that Greer and Zapruder were not the only ones to be startled by that noise. In fact, every non-victim in that limousine reacted in almost perfect unison with Zapruder's reaction. Mrs. Nellie Connolly was sitting in the jump seat next to her husband that day. Her testimony that her husband was wounded sometime after the president has been frequently cited by critics as a refutation to the single bullet theory.
I heard that noise, and we'd had so many noises with motorcycles and all that, you know, that I thought. But I looked back at the president, and I saw his hands fly up to his face, and then he just sunk down in the car. Said nothing, did nothing. His eyes looked strange, but I knew then that he had been hit. John, sitting in front of the president, knew it was a shot because he shoots. And he turned to the right and couldn't see him, flipped around to the left and couldn't see him. He said, no, 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 because he knew that's what happened.
Right.
On the back turn, about halfway, John was just about halfway back, came the second shot that hit John.
But Governor Connolly contradicted his wife's statement that she thought he was hit after he shouted, "Oh, no, no, no." He, in fact, remembered shouting after he was hit. But during that time, she could only see her husband's back, and like Governor Connolly, she never heard the shot that actually hit him. Mrs. Connolly testified that when she heard that shot, she immediately turned to her husband and pulled him down and back to her. We can see her do exactly that within a fraction of a second following frame 285. While Mrs. Connolly was mainly focused on the president, Mrs. Kennedy's attention had been drawn to Governor Connolly, who had begun to shout. But she then heard a gunshot which caused her to turn back to her right and toward her own husband, thinking that he was receiving a bullet. That could only have been the same shot that Mrs. Connolly heard. But the wives were not the only ones to react to that gunshot. Watch Bill Greer spin around so fast that some theorists thought his turn was humanly impossible. Greer also testified that he felt what he called a concussion from that shot, which could only have been the shock wave of the passing bullet. Roy Kellerman's reaction was probably the most definitive. Watch the blow-up of him dropping his head as he raises his left hand to shield his ear. Counting Zapruder, 5 people reacted to that gunshot, all beginning within the same 1/6 of a second of one another, and each of their testimonies were consistent with the shot at frame 285. Here is what might have happened. At frame 255, we see that the limo's left front tire was right up against the left center lane marker on Elm Street. But by frame 285, the limo's drifted about 5 to 6 feet to the right as Greer turned to look back over his right shoulder. When that happened, it would have created a major problem for a shooter in the Daltex building. Throughout most of the attack, a sniper in that location would have had no trouble drawing a bead on President Kennedy. But what if just as he was pulling the trigger, the limo swerved to the right, causing the Secret Service agent standing on the right side of the follow-up car to come between him and his target? Using the HSCA surveyor's diagram, it's quite easy to calculate the trajectory of a near miss to the right at frame 285. What might have happened is that a shot from the Daltex went on to strike the pavement on Main Street, where it shattered, sending a piece of lead to strike the curbing and a tiny piece of debris to nick bystander James Tague. Now, I can't call that an absolute certainty. A single shooter in the Daltex would only have had a little more than 3 seconds to remove his suppressor or switch rifles, and I don't think that was possible. It's not at all unreasonable, however, to consider that there was another gunman with him, with his own weapon. But there's another possibility as well. Officer J.W. Foster, who was positioned on the overpass, testified before the Warren Commission and said that a bullet struck the concrete surrounding a storm drain on the south side of Elm Street. If that was correct and Oswald fired that shot, the trajectory would pass directly over the president's limousine, but 15 feet above it. Such a shot could only have been a deliberate miss, and almost certainly would have been a warning shot. In striking the concrete, that shot could also explain Tegg's minor wound and the lead smear on the curbing on Main Street. But regardless of where that shot came from, it settles the conspiracy question. Oswald might have fired it or the one that followed 1.5 seconds later, but he could not have fired both. The next shot was the terrible and explosive headshot that killed President Kennedy. Many critics believe it came from the front due to the motion of the head traveling back and to the left. But it's quite easy to see that the head is first driven forward and downward. Dr. Alvarez and other experts believe that the reason it then traveled left and to the rear was that the explosion which blew out the right temple area created a thrust that propelled the head in that direction. We also know that a bullet fragment cracked the inside of the windshield while another was embedded in the chrome. Other fragments were found on the front floorboard. And this is the only shot that fragmented in such a way that it could have caused that to happen. This is frame 313, in which we see the terrible explosion of the president's head. Using a second-generation copy of the film, photographic experts with the iTech Corporation analyzed this frame and concluded that all major pieces of tissue and bone were blown forward and to the front at a speed of about 85 miles per hour. And in fact, when we examine frames well after the explosion had subsided, we see no damage at all to the back of the head. And yet motorcycle officers Hargis and Martin, riding well to the rear and left of the limo, both stated they were spattered by blood and tissue. Martin was a little over 20 feet away from the president at the time. At the time of the fatal headshot, witness Charles Brem, who was standing far to the rear of the limousine then, saw a piece of skull bone blown to the rear and land next to him.
Did you see any particles of the president's skull fly when the bullet struck him in the head?
I saw a piece fly over, in the area of the curb where I was standing.
And in which direction did that fly?
It seemed to have come left and back.
And although he never told the Warren Commission about it, FBI agent Robert Frazier admitted in sworn testimony at the Shaw trial that the FBI discovered considerable quantities of blood and tissue on the trunk of the limousine. So, how do we explain what happened? Well, we get a major clue when we look at that previously undamaged back of the head about a second later at frame 335. The president's head has become grotesquely misshapen, with a large protrusion in the rear. We see the same thing in the next clear frame, which is number 337. This is an extreme blow-up of that frame. Notice how large that protrusion is. Also notice that at the very top of the head, there's an area that almost seems to be gouged out. And finally, notice that there's no longer any hair in the upper frontal part of the head. That hair was still in place at frame 317. So, how and when did this additional massive damage occur? Well, to understand what happened, we first need to look at a very important X-ray. Look at that large piece of skull sitting at the top of the head. Notice that it's entirely broken away from the rest of the skull. That large piece of skull was blown to the rear and remained suspended in the scalp, forming that large protrusion we saw. When that happened, hair and scalp in the upper forward part of the head was ripped out and folded back over the inner surface of that broken skull piece. There is just no other plausible explanation for what we're seeing. Look at where the skull piece used to be. and where the hair in the upper forward part of the head used to be. And we can see where that hair, which was ripped out of place, has folded back over part of the inner surface of that broken piece of skull. Once we understand this, we solve a lot of mysteries. Most of the doctors and nurses at Parkland who saw the back of the president's head said they saw massive damage there. But in the autopsy photos, we don't see that damage. So does that mean that the photos were forgeries? Of course not. Look at Dr. Boswell's hand pulling the scalp in order to keep it from falling back. What they did was simply pull the scalp and the connected piece of skull back into place. Dr. Thornton Boswell was asked about this photo in his testimony before the ARRB. He said, in this one, it's pulled forward up over the forehead toward the forehead. I think that I probably was pulling the scalp up. During that same testimony, he explained the damage in greater detail. He said there was a big wound sort of transverse, up like this from the left posterior to right anterior. The scalp was separated, but it was folded over, and you could fold the scalp over and almost hide the wound. When you lifted the scalp up, you could really lay it back posteriorly, and there was a lot of bone still attached to the scalp, but detached from the remainder of the skull. And of course he was talking about this piece of skull. This solves another mystery as well. Dr. Humes told the Warren Commission that the size of the large defect at the top of the head was only 13 centimeters from front to back, but Boswell measured it as 17 centimeters. What happened was that Boswell measured that defect with the head laid open as we saw it in Zapruder frame 337. But Humes measured it after that skull piece and the scalp was pushed back into place. Of course, Mrs. Kennedy saw the same thing that we see, only in greater detail. These statements are from her Warren Commission testimony. Both of them were originally deleted from the transcript. I was trying to hold his hair on. From the back you could see, you were trying to hold his hair on and his skull on. And I could see a piece of his skull sort of wedge-shaped like that, and I remember that it was flesh-colored with little ridges at the top. Mrs. Kennedy could not have seen ridges unless that skull piece had been inverted, exposing its inner surface. The next question, and probably the most important one, is when was this damage inflicted? Was it the result of a second headshot, or was it perhaps a delayed reaction from the explosion at frame 313? The answer to that question will also come from Mrs. Kennedy. It has been claimed that she was trying to escape from the limousine, in spite of the fact that she made no attempt to climb over the back of the seat. Nor did any part of her lower body ever touch the surface of the trunk. But watch her right arm and hand. In his original report, Clint Hill, who was just inches from Mrs. Kennedy, said she raised out of her seat as if she were reaching to her right rear toward the back of the car for something that had blown out. At that time, Mrs. Kennedy stated exactly what it was that she recovered. Mrs. Connolly, sitting in the seat directly in front of her, testified, and then after the third shot she said, "They have killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." And she repeated that several times. Governor Connolly had heard her say exactly the same thing, but only once, undoubtedly because, as he stated in his testimony, he completely lost consciousness before the limo was out of Dealey Plaza. Mrs. Kennedy carried that brain tissue with her all the way to Parkland Hospital, and then gave it to Dr. Marion Jenkins. Once we understand that she reached back across the trunk and recovered a piece of her husband's brain tissue, the next question is, when and how could she have realized that it was back there? In the film, we don't see her looking around in any direction prior to rising from her seat. She gave us an important clue in her interview with journalist Theodore White in December of 1963. Here she's describing what had to have been the last thing she saw before getting up and recovering that brain tissue. She said, "I can see a piece of his skull coming off. It was flesh-colored, not white. He was holding out his hand. And I can see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head." Obviously, she didn't look back and see the tissue on the trunk before she got up. Therefore, she had to have seen that tissue being ejected to the rear. So, when could that have happened? This is frame 312, 1/18th of a second before the fatal head wound. Notice that she is looking down and away from her husband. At frame 316, she is still looking down and away from him. She starts to turn back toward him. Frame 323 is the first time since the terrible explosion that she looks toward him. She could not have seen anything ejected to the rear prior to this point in time. Unfortunately, there are a lot of blurry frames in this part of the film, so it's really impossible to pinpoint when it happened. But sometime after frame 317, Mrs. Kennedy saw that piece of tissue ejected from her husband's head, and that could only have been the result of a second headshot which blew blood, tissue, and bone to the rear. The three top independent experts to study the JFK X-rays at the National Archives were Dr. Joseph Riley, Dr. Randy Robertson, and Dr. David Maddock. They each did their research at different times and formed their conclusions independently, and all three of them expressed absolute certainty that the president was hit in the head twice. Dr. Joseph Riley, who holds a Ph.D. in neuroscience and neuroanatomy, concluded John Kennedy was struck in the head by 2 bullets, one from the right front and one from the rear. Dr. Randy Robertson, an M.D. and a board-certified radiologist, stated, "In sum, it is a medical and scientific fact that the damage to the president's skull did not result from a single shot, but was instead caused by 2 separate bullets." And Dr. David Maddock, who's an M.D. with a Ph.D. in physics and who is a certified radiologist, stated unequivocally there were 2 shots which struck the head. If my analysis is correct, then 3 shots were fired at the very end of the attack. The shots at 285 and 312 were extremely loud, but the final shot about half a second later probably came from a handgun and was drowned out by the one before it. Nonetheless, it was heard by many of the people in that area. In his testimony before the Warren Commission, Clint Hill stated, "I jumped from the car, realizing that something was wrong, ran to the presidential limousine. Just about as I reached it, there was another sound which was different than the first sound." But Hill did not approach the limousine until well after the first headshot. He had to have been talking about another gunshot that followed. Combat veteran Charles Brim told the FBI that he heard 3 closely spaced shots as the limo passed directly in front of him. During interviews on the day of the assassination, Brim stated that the president was just 15 feet away from him when the first of those shots was fired. At frame 285, he was actually about 18 feet from the president. Standing about 15 feet to his left, Jean Hill told a nearly identical story about what she heard, stating that as her friend Mary Mormon was about to snap her last picture, 3 or 4 shots rang out just as the motorcade took off. Jean Hill's credibility has been questioned because over the years she changed her story, claiming she saw a shot being fired from the grassy knoll. But in this case, we don't have to take her word for it. Look at this animation that locks into Jean's position as the limo passes in front of her. Within less than a third of a second after Zapruder and the limo passengers reacted, we see Jean Hill snap her head sharply to the right and away from the president at extreme speed. And Mary Mormon said essentially the same thing that Bremen Hill did. She told the sheriff's department, "As President Kennedy was opposite me, I took a picture of him. As I snapped the picture of President Kennedy, I heard a shot ring out. President Kennedy kind of slumped over, then I heard another shot ring out. When I heard these shots ring out, I fell to the ground to keep from being hit myself. I heard 3 or 4 shots in all."
Realize what had happened when you heard the shot?
No, I didn't. There was 3 or 4 real close together, and it was must have been the first one that shot him.
Charles Brehm also gave us an important clue about where that final shot came from, although he later changed his story, or was persuaded to change his story. On 11/22 of 1963, he told the Dallas Times-Herald that shots came from in front of or beside the president. Special Agent Paul Landis, who was standing on the running board of the follow-up car, described the final shot this way: "My reaction at this time was that the shot came from somewhere towards the front, right-handed side of the road." Of course, the most popular theory among critics has been that shots were fired from the grassy knoll, but there is really no place there where a shooter could feel confident that he would remain unseen, and in fact no witnesses at that time claimed to have seen a shooter there. A less popular theory is held that the president was shot from a storm drain on the north side of Elm Street. Over the years, the opening to the drain has been reduced to a narrow slit as layers of asphalt have piled up each time the street was repaved, but in 1963 it was about 6 inches tall. This theory has been ridiculed because at the time of the first headshot, a sniper from inside the drain could not have seen President Kennedy. I confirmed that myself back in 1995. But at the time the second shot was fired, the president had just pulled into view. If that shot had been fired at approximately frame 323, it would have hit the president on a rising angle of just under 4 degrees at a distance of 70 feet. The lateral angle would have been about 22 degrees. A shot at that instant would certainly explain how blood and tissue were blown out into the trunk and struck officers Martin and Hargis, and how a piece of skull was blown to the rear which landed near Charles Brehm. By then the president was leaning very sharply to his left, so the damaged area was not visible to Zapruder's camera. Johnny Roselli has always been a primary suspect in the JFK case. He was recruited by the CIA to assist them in trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. And CIA pilot Tosh Plumley claims that he flew Roselli and several other mafia hoodlums into Dallas on the morning of the assassination after they told him they were going there to protect the president. But Roselli had a bad habit of talking too much. He testified about the assassination before the Select Committee on Intelligence Activities, and he told Washington Post columnist Jack Anderson that the Mafia ordered Jack Ruby to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 weeks later, on July 28th, Roselli turned up missing. His dismembered body was later found floating in an oil drum off the coast of Miami. In his book Bound by Honor, Mafia godfather Bill Bonanno, who was a good friend of Roselli's, stated that Roselli told him he took part in the assassination and that he shot Kennedy from that same storm drain. Nonetheless, there is no way, to my knowledge, to determine with absolute certainty where that shot came from. It could have come from the grassy knoll, and some researchers, including Dr. David Maddock, believe the second headshot might have come from an entirely different storm drain further to the west. But consider this, that last shot was entirely unnecessary. It stands to reason that any shooter who saw the president's head explode would not have bothered to fire another shot. To the best of my knowledge, the North Storm Drain is the only plausible sniper location in Dealey Plaza where the shooter could not have seen the explosion and would not have realized that he didn't need to shoot again. So, what conclusions can we draw? Well, Oswald could not have fired prior to frame 285, nor could anyone else using a high-powered rifle. Because we can see that there were no startle reactions by the limo passengers then. Yes, we can see them looking around. They obviously heard something, but they didn't act at all like they did following the shots at the end. And if Oswald had been firing those early shots, they would have been louder and more startling than the later shots because the limo was closer to him then. In fact, the sound levels would have been 16 times louder than the level that psychologists use to provoke involuntary startle reactions in their test subjects. This photo was taken by James Altgens at the equivalent of a Zapruder frame 255, after at least 2 and probably 3 shots have been fired. A few people are looking around, but we mostly see happy, smiling faces. No one is panicking, no one is screaming. And what about the Secret Service? Were they really being sluggish that day and too lazy to rush to help the president? Of course not. But up to this point, they have heard nothing that sounds like a real gunshot. And of course that explains why most of the witnesses that day heard only one ambiguous noise and then 2 loud shots at the end of the attack. It was only after frames 285 and 312 that we see the kind of reactions we would expect from high-powered rifle shots. So, those 2 shots were the only ones that came from high-powered rifles. And because they were so closely spaced, Oswald could only have fired one of them. And notice that the limo passengers react much more dramatically the second time than they do the first. What that tells us is that the shot at 285 was not as loud as the fatal headshot. Oswald's rifle was indeed loud, but it was less than half as loud as many other popular rifles, such as the M16, the AK-47, or a 7.65 Mauser. Although we can't say for certain, that does seem to suggest that the shot at 285 was more likely to have come from Oswald's gun than the more powerful shot that followed. And there may be another reason as well. As we mentioned earlier, a shot from Oswald at frame 285 that struck the concrete surrounding the drain on the south side of Elm would have passed about 15 feet directly above the president's limousine. In fact, if that shot was fired by Oswald, it could only have been a deliberate miss and undoubtedly a warning shot in the hope of provoking the driver to hurry up and get out of Dealey Plaza. If instead Oswald had fired the fatal shot 1.5 seconds later, he would have had to fire over the heads of the Secret Service agents standing on the right side of the follow-up car behind the limousine. I've spent a lot of time looking at the geometry here, and whether the shot was possible or not was a very close call. It really depends on the exact distance between JFK and Agent John Reddy at the instant that shot was fired. But at the very least, looking through the rifle sights, Oswald could only have seen part of the president's head at the time he pulled the trigger. That shot would have been very difficult. But if the shot had been fired from a window further west on that same floor, the agents on the running board would have posed no problem at all. For many years, I've tried to figure out whether Oswald was guilty or innocent of the assassination of President Kennedy. And I'll be honest with you, I'm just not certain. But I will suggest a theory which I think is worth considering. Based on a great deal of other evidence, I don't think there's any real doubt that Carlos Marcello set up the assassination, exactly as he confessed to an FBI informant. This is how he explained his connection to Oswald. One night Marcello was talking about the Kennedys. He told me and my friend about a meeting with Oswald. He had been introduced to Oswald by a man named Ferry, who was Marcelo's pilot. He said that the meeting had taken place in his brother's restaurant. He said that he thought that Oswald was crazy. They had several meetings before he left town. I think what might have happened is that as the limo proceeded down Elm Street, the thought struck Oswald, what the hell am I doing here? And then he fired a shot which passed well above the heads of the limo passengers, just as he fired a missed shot at General Walker. The next shot was perfect, and it bore all the air marks of a professional sniper. But whether Oswald was guilty or not is really a secondary issue. I think what is more important is the question of who was really behind the attack and why J. Edgar Hoover went to such extreme lengths to cover up the Mafia's involvement. I know I haven't answered all the questions surrounding this crime, and I doubt that I ever will. But I hope that at the very least, I made it clear that the attack was not the result of a single sniper. Thanks for listening, folks, and please keep an eye on my website at jfkhistory.com for further updates, as well as my YouTube account, which is Bob Harris 77. In this video, we're going to examine the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. As we do this, I'm going to show you things from a different perspective than you've probably ever seen before. Of course, what you choose to believe is up to you, but consider this. For any explanation to be correct, it needs to answer a lot of questions. And those answers need to be consistent with each other and with the known facts of the case. As you will soon see, none of this is rocket science, but it does require that we focus and do a little thinking, so I'm not going to ask you to sit back and enjoy this video. Instead, I hope you will lean forward, take a few notes, rewind and re-examine the video when you need to, and join me in solving at least some of the most perplexing issues related to this crime. Elsie Dorman may have been the worst camera operator in Dealey Plaza that day. She didn't seem to quite grasp the concept of holding the camera steady. But in her film, we get a glimpse of a little 13-year-old girl who was doing a much better job of operating her movie camera. Her name was Tina Towner, and that brings us to the first question we'll be trying to resolve. Over the years, Tina's movie has been all but ignored by JFK researchers. In it, she captures the limousine as it turns from Houston on. In 1963, there were only a few offices on that third floor, and much of it was used to store boxes, so it would have been easy to set up a sniper's nest similar to the one in the depository. Only one professional criminal was apprehended in Dealey Plaza that day. His name was Jim Braden, and he was discovered on the third floor of the Daltex building. When he was first questioned, Braden admitted that he was in the Daltex building during the assassination. But after he was taken to the sheriff's office, he changed his story, claiming that he was only there after the shooting had ended. He later told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he was visiting his parole officer during the assassination, a claim that his parole officer, Roger Carroll, refused to confirm. We'll be talking more about Braden later. This is a photo taken from the Daltex building looking west down Elm Street. The view and the angles from there are absolutely perfect. But being in such an excellent location, how could the shooter have missed and hit the pavement? Well, I'm going to answer that question for you, but first let me ask you a question. If you were that sniper and you just missed the entire limousine, what would you do next? That's right, you'd fire again, wouldn't you? Shortly after Tina stopped shooting, Abraham Zapruder turned on his camera. To see when the next shot was fired, we'll be looking at extreme blow-ups of the earliest parts of that film. Notice the president dropping his right hand. Shortly after frame 165, we will see. According to Gary Mack at the 6th Floor Museum, Tina Towner said that no one in her family knows when or how those frames were destroyed. So if Tina's family didn't damage the film, then it must have happened while it was in the FBI's possession. Over the years, I've examined every available film to try to find one that would give us a better look at JFK's reaction then. I almost found it in the film taken by Robert Hughes, which also captured the limousine as it made that turn onto Elm Street. It was taken from a greater distance, but the original frames could be blown up and would very likely show JFK's movement then. But guess what happened? The film was damaged at exactly the same point in time that Tina's film was damaged. So it appears that the FBI destroyed frames in both the Towner and the Hughes films, which depicted the same fraction of a second in which President Kennedy reacted to that first shot. Now, if that wasn't done deliberately, then at the very least, it proves that they were certainly interested in those frames, enough so that they stopped the film to examine them long enough to let them burn up. Many theorists, including most of the government defenders, believe that an early shot struck the pavement, which explains why some witnesses recall seeing sparks flying up from the road. That would suggest that President Kennedy could have been pelted by small pieces of asphalt or metal. But in spite of his reaction, the president doesn't appear to be too concerned. He seems to have felt something, but like the others around him, he didn't hear anything that he perceived to be a gunshot. In fact, Tina Towner stated that she never heard a gunshot until sometime after she stopped filming. So, one of two things happened. The president's reactions were either caused by something other than a gunshot, or they were the result of a gunshot that no one heard. This is an overhead view of the intersection of Houston and Elm Street. Notice the positions of Tina Towner, the Texas School Book Depository, and the Daltex building. I've also illustrated the positions of the limousine as it made that very sharp turn onto Elm. What I believe I can demonstrate is that the earliest shots that day were fired from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building. We get a good look at that building and the windows facing down Elm Street in this photo taken by James Alchins. I used to believe that the shots came from behind the fire escape, but I think I was mistaken about that. The angle for the shots as the limo turned onto Elm Street would actually be better from the southernmost window facing west down Elm. If we blow up this very high-resolution copy of the Alton's photo and bring up the contrast a bit, we make an extremely interesting discovery about that window. Look closely. Part of that window has been broken out. As we see in other windows, the glass looks a bit grayish, probably because the windows are dusty. But in places where there is no glass, the area looks darker. And the location of that broken area is fully consistent with where a shooter sitting a few feet back from the window would want it to be. Elm Street. More importantly, she may have captured President Kennedy reacting to the first shot that was fired that day, several seconds before Abraham Zapruder had even begun to film. Her film captured the limousine as it passed in front of the Daltex building, which was across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. As the limousine makes that turn, President Kennedy begins to wave to the crowd. But then something rather strange happened. He starts to wave to the crowd, but then within half a second, he pulls his hand back and balls it into a fist. Please watch closely and keep in mind that this is in extreme slow motion. Each frame lasts for about 1/18 of a second. And then something else happened that was pretty strange. The film was damaged, and approximately 7 frames were destroyed. It was during those 7 missing frames that President Kennedy fell sharply to his left. Because the frames were deleted, we aren't able to see it happen, but we can easily see him straighten back up. And this is not an optical illusion. Compare President Kennedy's motion with Jackie and the other people in the car. He's the only one who reacts this way. Okay, so JFK starts to raise his right hand to wave to the crowd, but then suddenly he pulls it back and balls his hand into a fist, and then he falls sharply to his left, and then he straightens back up. There had to be a reason for that. There had to be a cause.